You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from the Encore series, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations. Welcome back to the second and final part of this Encore series, where we last introduced a National Law Enforcement Museum hosted program titled Spotlight on Law Enforcement Anti-Bias Programs, which originally aired on August 10th, 2020, to examine the effectiveness and influences of anti-bias training programs in law enforcement and communities across the country. Now that Pride Month is in full swing, we can officially announce that the museum has developed a digital exhibit titled Pride Behind the Badge: Experience the History of LGBTQIA+ in Law Enforcement, set to publish on June 27th in conjunction with a series of Icons episodes featuring the 6 participants of that digital exhibit. They will share their stories and wisdom while serving in law enforcement. Lastly, some of these participants will take part in a panel discussion to air on YouTube on June 28th at 2 p.m., similarly titled as the digital exhibit, Pride Behind the Badge: A History of LGBTQIA+ in Law Enforcement, to speak directly about the difficulties and progress that has taken place in law enforcement over the years. Check the episode description for links to our website and social media channels to find more information about these upcoming events. And now back to this episode of Encore. We last heard from the panelists about what anti-bias training is, its effectiveness, and defining some key terms. Part 2 continues that discussion and how important it is for the community to be involved, like showcasing this training in schools. To conclude this series, panelists answer questions from the original program livestream. And now for Part 2 of Spotlight on Law Enforcement Anti-Bias Programs.
I would just want to say, yes, it works when all the parts that are needed are in play. And so you have to start with assessing the particular group you're working with versus coming in with just a one size fits all. You have to assess the needs of the particular department you're working with, the group you're working with, and then whoever the facilitators are, the department has to trust them. Just between the facilitators and the department, there has to be trust built there so that they trust. We're not trying to sell them a bag of goods, and then included in there, you need skills that talk about relationship, skills that talk about that we listen with intent to learn, skills of those nature. And when you develop strong relationships, even within the department, you're willing to talk about these more difficult things. And so until you get to that needs assessment, build trust within the department, and then you can go after some of the hard stuff, which when you do that, then you're prepped to go into the community to hear the harder conversations with them.
So I want to stay on you for a second, because I know you do this work. Can you just briefly tell us about, what's your experience with this type of training?
Chief Brooks and I have been doing this for probably about 15 years together now. And so we do a partnership where I'm from the community and she's from law enforcement. And early on, we had to figure out how is it that how do we bridge each other? How does she, as a police officer, a law enforcement individual, break the barrier with community, as a Black woman also, and me as a Latino man who's not law enforcement? How do I gain the trust of the officers? And let me tell you what I figured out in the beginning. And I'm a retired steel worker. I worked 27 years in the steel mill, and I was involved with the union. And when I closed my eyes and listened to the muster room of officers, I thought I was in the steel mill. They were working class kind of people. And if you don't understand that when you're working with them, you will never gain their trust. And I was just very fortunate that that's what I came from. And I was able to use that experience to help them. Listen, I'm here to help you. Once we gain their trust, and one more thing I want to say, this training, to be most effective, doesn't mean that every officer in the department is going to be the best at it. There are going to be some officers that probably will take the training and not want anything to do with it anymore, and that does not make them a bad police officer. But then you're going to have other officers who are going to take to this like a duck to water. And they're the ones that cause the change within the institution. They're the ones that make change with the community. And when you have a significant portion of people working in this way, rowing together, departments change, communities get better. We have difficult conversations because we want to be together.
And I'd like to add to what Guillermo just said as well, is that what we also do with the training is that we acknowledge and recognize that police is a culture as well. And so we don't go into the training pointing fingers saying, you're bad, you have to do this, you need to do this. We also have an opportunity for the police officers to acknowledge and be appreciated for their culture, because we have a culture. That is important when you go and you meet with community, because a lot of times police officers have the sense that I can't show my emotions, I can't share anything with you, I have to just be just about the facts. When actually, if you can lower your guard just a little bit, I'm not saying interfere with officer safety, but what I am saying is when you connect with the community on a human level, then they start to appreciate and trust you, because they feel like you know what they're talking about, as opposed to just coming in, taking a report, checking the box, and then leaving. Spending a couple extra minutes just listening to their stories means a lot, and it puts that money in the bank, as it were, because it's not an if, it's a when. When something's going to happen, you want some money in the bank with the community so that they have a sense that they can trust you. And over the years, that hasn't been as important as it needs to be.
One more thing I want to say is that it's important to separate the difference between being uncomfortable and unsafe. We would never ask a police department or train anybody into not trusting their safety training. Absolutely trust your safety training. But there has to be a place where uncomfortable, and I can tell you in my life, the places where I have learned the most is when I was uncomfortable. But you separate when you're unsafe and you're uncomfortable, and lean into the uncomfortable, because that's where we learn the most.
So with that, next question I'm going to ask for the panelists is, do you believe that bias training or anti-bias training should be taught in schools or to community members also?
Yes.
I don't like to ask absolute questions, but if so, why? And why? And let me go. Why? And what would that look like? I know I threw that last link in there.
So I think it should be taught in schools, in community education programs, in court systems, in judicial systems, for attorneys, for everybody, because every person has biases. And all of those entities have an impact, negative or positive, in the community. So how would that look like? Similar to what we do with law enforcement training and with community. We bring community and law enforcement together. We talk to them about how to interact with people and thinking about customer service. Now, that back when I was early in my career, one of my lieutenants sent out around an article for us in the roll call room to hear about customer service. You can imagine what the reaction was, right? We don't have any customers. Well, if the city could fire you, and my agency had that opportunity with us, it would change your mindset about customer service. So what is it about going to a store that keeps you going back to the store? The elements of customer service are tone of voice, how you interact with people, being reliable, being responsive. Those elements fit with law enforcement. They can also fit with community because community has us versus them as well, and they don't trust the police when actually if we spent more time together, we would be trusting each other more. So that sort of is a little bit of why I said yes so quickly.
Thank you, Doctor.
If I could, I'd like to also just piggyback right on what you said. I've always said and truly believe that it is all about customer service. And I actually teach a class specifically about that. It's all about the relationships we build. As law enforcement officers, we're allowed to do, we're granted a certain amount of powers, but those powers don't come without a responsibility on our part to be able to have that community support and trust. And so I agree that a good balanced dialogue and discussion on the cultural diversity of people and the way we process things differently can do nothing but cause us to do a lot of reflection on ourselves and our own beliefs. And I think if it's done properly, absolutely we can benefit from that. But I will absolutely have to agree with Chief. We are in the business of customer service, and the way we deliver that service is going to determine whether or not we meet the expectations of our communities. And if you look at what's going on across the country right now, I think it just illustrates that we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else want to chime in on that one?
I would just add to that and just say also, keep in mind, schools represent our future workforce in law enforcement.
Right.
So you've got this amazing opportunity to talk to young people. Nobody's a lot of program in schools right now, but I would tell you that's a great opportunity to begin to recruit and educate and inform these young people about our profession, about what our morals are, our ethics, and we believe in. There's an opportunity to protect and serve their own communities. But the biggest thing is a pipeline to our profession.
Booker, I would just add that many cities across the country have established police community academies where community members and law enforcement officers are, working together to understand, assess the problems in the community, and then also learn something about each other and the rules and the processes and procedures associated with policing. A lot of people don't have this information, and it's very helpful in building, foundation for relationship. The police athletic leagues, the community block clubs where police officers are assigned to very specific neighborhoods and given the time that they need to build relationships that are based on mutual respect. These things all, have a way of helping to bridge the gap that exists between our police departments and our communities. These programs are not, fluff, wish we could do kinds of things. These things are really important and critical to have establishing, positive police community relations. One of the reasons why I'm such a fan of the work that Noble does is they have a specific strategy associated with reaching out to the children in the communities where their chapters are present. This builds a pipeline for recruits, but it also just builds, a long-standing relationship, of mutual trust and respect. And you never know when you might have to tap into, those relationships to get some support that law enforcement needs in our community to more effectively do their job.
Thank you. So I'm going to add a caveat to this question that I want people to weigh in on. If police come from society, right? Police, the foundation of policing is based in society. People, humans make up police forces. All of the talk has been about anti-bias training for law enforcement. And it seems like the expectation is that we're going to take training and give it to people when they join the profession. But should the emphasis be on trying to focus on that training in a foundational framework as the vast majority of law enforcement officers all come from the public? And if people believe that we should focus on the public, and here's the jump in the water question. How do we teach the public now to not cast all police officers in the same light when one police officer or a few police officers make public mistakes?
Can you repeat your question one more time? I missed the last part.
Oh, I said, so law enforcement officers come from, the foundation of law enforcement officers is general public. So I said, do you think bias training would be better focused, just two-part. Would bias training be better focused on dealing with the community right now? And if so, in this current environment, how do we teach the public that, how would we frame it, the conversations around people casting lights on the entire law enforcement profession based on the actions of a few officers? And essentially right now, you got kids out there that the minute they see somebody in a uniform, it doesn't matter who that person is, it's just you have a uniform on. So how should we go about focusing the training more in society in conjunction with law enforcement? And how would we work that training now to teach people not to view police officers all in the same light?
I like the question, but I think that these are not mutually exclusive, right? So these things have to happen simultaneously. But the other part that we have to talk about is why folks are ascribing the events of one person to an entire group of people, right? And what the community would tell you, it's the same thing they believe police officers do about the Black community. One person does something wrong and the entire community is paying the price for that. And so that, for me, that's where it starts. I think it was said earlier, we have so many similarities on where we want to be that we're going to have to be able to unpack that. And I think before you can bring groups together to have that conversation, those are in cultural conversations, right? So if we talk about historically how people perceive them being viewed by other folks, cops are talking about the same thing, right? You're saying that, this one person in Minneapolis and we're all that way. We're not all that way. That message is getting lost, as it is when you have a person of color commit a crime. We're not all that way. That's one person. Why are we being attached to the individual decision that was made of others? We're talking the same language. For some reason, we can't hear each other. And so to me, that's where that training begins. We're all occupying the same space, living in two different worlds. I would have never believed it when I was younger if somebody would have told me that. You're speaking different languages, but we're all trying to get to the same space. The training for me that's a part of it, right? So it's just a small part of it. I think most, depending on who you talk to, would say they have biases. They have biases against police officers and vice versa. But it is that process we do together to get there. So I don't think you have to do one before the other. I think all of that work should be happening now. But in order for work to happen in that way, you still have to address the things that are coming up. For some reason, we just want to sort of put aside historically what has happened. And for some, everybody's like, it's history, it wasn't me. But it's also a signal that you don't understand the power of that uniform and what it meant historically and currently for some folks. We're not talking about ancient history, we're talking about recent history. So I think there's ways in which we have to have these conversations and teach folks. But I also have to remind community that cops don't make policy. I have stood in more community meetings about cops doing things that cops were told to do. And if you want to start yelling at somebody, the chief needs to be, forgive me, my former chiefs, push that chief up front and have them answer to that. Answer why you've decided that this was the way you wanted to approach it. And this is when we talk about why organizations have to have diversity through the ranks, because there are different lived experiences. There are different perspectives, but these aren't two separate things. I don't think you do one before the other. Everybody's got work to do and they need to get to work. That's the only thing I can tell you. So everybody's got work to do.
And if I could piggyback on what Dr. Kesey just said, when we do an assessment of the department, we also do an assessment with the community, because you can't do it without both of them. And so we ask the community the same question we're asking the police. What is going well? What could be better? What would you be willing to do to make it change and to make a difference? And if you could change something, what would you change? And based on that assessment, that's how we develop the training that we provide to the police and to the community. Sometimes the police, and actually, we also preface the training by providing the information and a sort of not a test, but an awareness of what the training is going to be like to the police before we bring them with the community. Because, police officers don't like to share a lot of information. And they don't want to reveal much. So they just want to know we don't like surprises. So what's the training going to be like? And we found that when we take that step first, it helps the training go better because there's really no surprises in terms of the model. The surprises may come with the discussion, But that's different, and that's okay, because like Rachel said, it's uncomfortable. You lean into being uncomfortable, and then you have a better relationship through the end of it.
I would say,
I'm sorry, Guillermo.
I would add, you know the old saying, the truth shall set you free? Well, when it comes to education, especially our young people, the truth that we teach them will set us all free.
I was just going to add that when we should all spend a few moments just, thinking about what happens or what we think about when we deconstruct the fact that African American parents, brown children, all have to, by age 9 or 10 years old, have a talk with their children about what possibly could happen. And it's because of the stereotypes that Chief Brooks and Dr. Kesey have, shared. These stereotypes and these biases, have been embedded in, our kind of our thought process and the way that we assess, community, not just the police, but again, this is across the board. But we really need to, understand that everybody's got a role to play in kind of getting us where we need to go. But it starts with truth telling and people accepting, responsibility, for their actions. I grew up with my parents giving me the talk. I gave my talk to my kids. My kids, are calling me after Philando Castile and saying, "Mom, here's a guy who followed all the rules and he still got shot and killed. Am I really safe?" These are not conversations that you really want to have with your children, but they're based on, again, people stereotyping people because of race, where they live, class. I mean, you name it, it happens.
So thank you for that. We got a bunch of panel questions from people in the audience, but we're gonna ask one more question here, and before we get to audience questions, and then I'm gonna ask if the panel could stay over a little bit later than we intended due to the amount of questions that we have, and we'll kind of go from there. So the question that I have, just like many of you, I've taught this topic all over the country, and you kind of see nationally a difference in the police chief and the line officers, right? A lot of times you'll see line officers taking this training and the chief doesn't, right? And even in a lot of cases, you'll even see how most chiefs are politically aligned in a different alignment than the line officers, right? So what do you think, how would you suggest getting this training to not only to the line officers, but specifically to the leadership of a law enforcement organization?
Well, for us, we know how important it is for leadership's buy-in. If we don't have buy-in from leadership, I'm pretty sure we've turned down jobs because we couldn't get that. It just won't work. If you don't have the leadership walking the talk, why should the rest of the body follow? It just doesn't make sense when you don't have leadership taking it. So for us, I can't imagine it doing it any other way. And the other thing is, we actually train leadership in depending on how we assess it, in a more intense kind of way than we do the regular officers. We actually do a slightly different version for cadets, younger officers, and that has proved for us in the assessments we get that it helps from, I don't want to say get poisoned, but when you're working a position 20-some years, you have a particular way of looking at it. And when a young officer comes in, I've heard more than one said that they're told, forget about what you learned in the academy, I'll teach you what it's like. We have to strengthen the young officers to be able to resist that. And I am not condemning the officers that say that. I think we don't treat them well enough. Personally, I don't think anybody should be on the streets no more than 3 years at a time, and then taken off for a year and put in a position where they're doing, I don't know, social service. My thinking of what policing should do is a whole lot different than we do it now. We don't treat police human enough and expect a lot from them in that sense. So in my best thinking, I think there should be a kind of rotation to help them get through all the stuff that they figure out and get a better sense of the rest of the world.
I appreciate it.
It's interesting you say that, and then I'll get to Dr. Tracy here, and then after that, we'll get to audience questions. But that 3-year rotation piece that you talk about, most places, if you work narcotics, you're out of there in 3 years because they know that you can't stay in that position for more than 3 years without something going broken. So with that, Dr. Tracy?
So I think the question was, leadership. What do you do with that crew? Well, I think Guillermo said it right. You train them first.
Mm-hmm.
You'll get more out of training that group to determine whether or not this is going to be legit or not. And you can tell when you finish who you're going to have problems with. And those are conversations that you have with the chief. Because if the message gets distorted from the top, if one steps to the side and gets approached by a colleague and they ask for their opinion about what do you think, and they go, I think it's ridiculous, it's a done deal. And so it's really helping the chief understand not just the importance of it, but even looking at their own team. You're going to have issues within a team. Everybody knows that. But if you're all not on the same page about the perspective and the sort of the road forward, then it's going to be problematic. The other part that has to happen in that same space, and I think that, this is what we're talking about, is they have to unpack their own historical biases in that class, right? You come through the ranks, you've done some things, you've seen some things, and you behave that way. And you can't act as if all of a sudden when you put stars on that it was not you, because it was you. And anybody who's been raised in an organization long enough knows the history of our own folks. And so it's more than a class. It is really this self-reflective piece that has to be inserted into leadership for them to understand that you lead, but you also have to lead by example. And that's the thing I'm not hearing, right? Because we can have them in class, but I can tell you, I've had many chiefs in class and then go to a side conversation and they start talking about things I'm thinking, okay, well, that was a waste of time. So it's really about holding not just officers accountable, but the organization has to be held accountable to it as well.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. So we got some good audience questions, and I'm actually glad I'm sitting here and not where you are today. So the first question comes from Mr. Williams, and he says, how do we address the conflict between the perception of racist behavior by police and the statistics that officers shoot Black suspects at a rate lower than Black suspects shoot at officers, and less than the rate of violent criminal acts against their own communities?
So it depends on what report you're reading. So let's start by grounding in that way. But I want to speak more so to not just perception, but lived experience. And so as a scientist, I'm all for science, but there's one thing that you cannot ignore, and that's the lived true experience. Sometimes we do an over-reliance on science for that science to do the talking for us, helps actually describe what's going on or what may or may not be happening. The true work has to happen on the ground with police departments and community. And you'll hear people say, well, perception is someone's reality, which is very true, but lived experience and stories are truth. And one of the things that we have to keep from doing is trying to determine and impose who do we believe and who do we not believe. Because that's usually what we're coming down to now, that it's not as bad as you think it is, or it is as bad as you think it is. It is really what is happening in the practicality of how you find that out. So, and the reason why I appreciate that question, because that is the crux of the conversation, right? What's really happening? What's really not happening? And this is where we seem to get stuck. And it's a space what I call analysis paralysis. We could do this all day. All you got to do is get 5 scientists, you're going to give me 5 different outcomes. What I always tell people to really think about is broaden how you're understanding and learning. But if you really want to know what's going on, talk to the people who are closest to the problem, the cops and the community. They will more than likely give you what you need or tell you what you need in order to start making course adjustments. So as a scientist, I'm telling you, I love science, but science only can get you so far. And it can also be done to believe what you want to believe, which I'm not saying is wrong or right, but you have to broaden and have a better understanding about the lived experience that people are telling you. Folks are not in the street for no reason. And you got to understand that. Yeah, and this is beside the folks who are destroying things in a violent manner. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about 75 days of protesting, demonstrating. Those who are doing it peacefully are there for a reason. That's what you need to start understanding is why. Don't get distracted by what we used to say, by the folks that are, the knuckleheads are going to do what they're going to do. Try to understand why people are still in the street. And it's not just about policing, by the way. So I just want to make sure I lift that up too.
So I do think that this question is one that comes up a lot. And, I typically will tell people on this one, it's hard to have when you got feelings versus a fact, right? I mean, and there's some difference. You can't have both cases, right? You can't have a feelings argument with a fact person, and you can't have a fact argument with a feelings person. It just doesn't work, right? So you have to get together and get to a space to where at some point, you're going to have to come to some resolution. So I do think that is a good question to answer. And then the last part of his question is, how is it that we can address this perception that I'm adding the all term in here. How is it that we can address the perception that all law enforcement behavior is racist?
I don't think everybody has that same perception. They don't think all. There's some. I'm not going to say there's never anybody. There's some. But again, it goes back to the majority of the folks, majority of the people, and even the Black community think the police have a purpose. So you have to decide which soundbite you're listening to. But part of how you get rid of sort of this perception of, all cops are racist really is how we hold ourselves accountable. And part of the big conversation that we've been having over the last 3 months has been about accountability and whether or not it's been consistent. And whether or not, one day we say we can fire somebody, and most of us who, been a part of a union would know there's a due process there. So it's really about how do we then go about making sure that we understand that when we do absolutes, and Dr. Booker, like you just said, it's like it's emotion versus fact. But we can't do absolutes because not everybody thinks that way. When we get caught up in those absolutes is where we come out not having a conversation. Not everybody in the Black community thinks all white officers are racist. That's just it. There are going to be some, but not all. And so I'm like always careful with folks when we want to have these conversations. Let's not set up already. They all think this, because they all don't. They absolutely do not.
I think there are more people right now who think that we are not holding law enforcement officers accountable for their conduct. And I think accountability is just something that we just can't lose sight of.
So I'll go to Mr. Patrick.
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback on what was just said. I think the problem that we have is I do not believe that everyone thinks police officers are racist. I do think that there is a problem there, and I think it's one we need to take head on and have this dialogue. But I will say this: there is nothing that if we sat down together and had some conversations and realistically had an open mind to have these discussions, we couldn't find solutions to. I think the problem that we have in this space and time right now is there is just some people that just don't want that harmony. They don't want this dialogue, and they do everything to stop it. Look, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And if we truly are going to get past this, and I will have to agree with what the doctor said, that this is much greater than just law enforcement. We have a lot of issues here that are causing a lot of challenges in our communities. And if we don't take them all head on and have realistic conversations about it, we're just going to find ourselves here again having some conversation a little bit further down the road. We need to sit down, we need to have some open dialogue, and we need to have respect for each other. And that's something that simply doesn't exist. And it starts at the top. I mean, I'll look at city administrators in cities where we're trying to have dialogue and trying to have some solutions, and they create this bigger divide, and it makes it real hard to have these conversations with it. And we could explain it all the way up to the top or all the way to the bottom, but the reality is until we have, people willing to sit down and have some meaningful discussions on a path forward, we're going to have a hard time making any progress.
Thank you.
I think some of the things that are happening is when people are oppressed, And they are oppressed enough to, when they push back, they look up to see who's holding them down. And I think right now, when they look up, they see the police. The police are being used as middle agents in our society, and it's not fair. But unfortunately, that's where we're at. I think the other thing that has to happen is we have to learn in law enforcement and in leadership to understand when people are bringing up the issue of systemic racism, to not take it so personal. That systemic racism is centuries old. It is just come to the point now that the more we become clear as human beings, we understand the damage that it has done. And we are saying more than anything, this systemic thing has to stop. But unfortunately, many of the people that don't understand the history of it are taking it personal. And we have to figure out how to flush that out.
So hold that. I'm going to get back to that with the question after this question. So the next question, I don't want to butcher your last name, comes from Joshua. And he asks, his question is, are there any recommended unconscious bias awareness trainings that exist that have been widely accepted by police officers? And could you make any recommendations to any of these programs in which officers wouldn't get defensive and would be willing to learn in a positive way? Nobody wants to do no self-promotion.
Listen, I don't know of any, of all the departments that we have worked, when we come away, we always hear it's things like this. What we hear from the community are, when I drive by and I see a police officer pulled someone over, I pray for the person that was pulled over. After being part of this, I pray for both of them now. Those are the simple things that we have to shift. Officers are human too. And we just have to embrace some change here on the level of authorities. This middle agent piece that I talked about is big in this piece that we have to figure out. So yeah, I think we're effective. We always get actually come back, just they can never afford to bring us back a second time. Chief Brooks, what do you think?
So I'll piggyback on what Guillermo said. One of the things that I recognized when we first started doing the training is when the training started, officers were sitting there like this, right? By the end of the training, they were leaning in to hear what we had to say. And the compliment at the end of the training was, this wasn't so bad.
Yeah.
So for me, that's a good thing.
Then that's good. You know, I laugh when people always, say when they see a squad car, they get scared. And it's funny, like even when, I was in uniform driving a squad car, I see another squad car, I get scared. I'm in a car. And it has nothing to do with my race. It's just the fact that, am I speeding or something? And I'm in a marked squad car, right? So, people got to understand, cops are the same as people, right? It's just how we are. So the next question I will ask is from Mr. Ed Kennedy. And he asks, is there any evidence of institutional racism other than a subjective opinion, and what proves it exists?
Yeah, this is Dwayne here. Sadly enough, at least here in the United States, a significant amount of our American institutions have systemic racism. One, because they weren't necessarily created for African Americans, Latinos, or people of color when they were designed. This is going back hundreds of years. As relates to the current environment, whether you look at traffic stops or if you look at incarceration rates, you look at it and there's no reasonableness of how do you explain the differences in African Americans, for example, that have been incarcerated based on our percentage of the population. Or if you look at traffic stops. So yes, there's numerous levels of data. And I also should say this too. People always say to me, well, how do you correlate that to the whole nation? Keep in mind, there's also approximately 18,000 law enforcement agencies. The numbers I just gave or examples I gave are national. I would also say, though, everyday citizens can also sit down and look at your own local police department. You can actually ask questions about, I want to know the demographics of those that have been pulled over for traffic stops. And I also would say this was said earlier. Also, hold your elected officials accountable, your mayors, your city governors. It's what I said before. Most police agencies are reflecting what? People that they work for. They work for the citizens, but in many ways, they're also working for your mayors, your city council, county commissioners, et cetera.
Anybody else?
So Booker, I would just say that there are a number of studies that are available everywhere, every academic institution and every persuasion. So you can find evidence. Just for Minnesota, one of the bodies of evidence that we've been talking about for the last year has been a project that was done by the University of Minnesota called the Red Line Project. And it has provided historical evidence of institutional racism in banking that has really led to a serious income wealth gap in Minnesota. There are other reports that outlined from, again, the University of Minnesota, published in the New England Journal of Medical Science on historical and systemic racism in regard to COVID. And there's reports here in the United States and similar reports in the UK. So there is a body of evidence that people, if people are looking for them, can find I'm not sure why we're still questioning whether or not institutional racism exists, but if we are, there is certainly peer-reviewed evidence for the pervasiveness of institutional racism in our country in a number of sectors, not just in policing.
All right, thanks for that. So the next question is from a Josh Jasik. It says, how would you structure this long-term / continuous mitigating unconscious bias training in order to move away from the one and done training?
Chief Brooks and I use a 4-layered system. We start with a needs assessment. We go into trust building with the department itself. And then we go into skills building with them. And then we train them in sustainable partnership programs with the community. So it's a long process. This is, you don't just unpack this stuff. It's like opening up a suitcase and emptying it. It's not like that. This is tons of baggage that we have to get through. And the real work is teaching how to communicate in a way that you want to work together. And then the work continues with sustainable partnerships, that they continue the work. Our work is always that we teach them how to continue these skills, the trainings that we do, so they can do it for themselves. We believe in that whatever we do, they should be able to replicate, and it becomes sustainable.
I'd like to piggyback on that as well. And this is not a box that you check. Okay, we've had this training and it's done, and now we satisfy whatever reason we had it on there. I think what you have is, again, it goes back to the culture we talked about before, and it starts at the very top. But we can talk and we can train all we want. We can get officers in a room and we can talk about it, and we can have some meaningful discussion and maybe even have some self-reflection. But the key component to any success of this program would be a public involvement part of it. Now, I'll just offer one as a suggestion, because I had a good bit of experience in doing it, and that is, I don't think enough agencies across this country, and those who do it don't do it at a large enough bandwidth, is to do citizens academies. Citizens academies do two things. One, they teach people what they teach why we do the complexities of law enforcement that I think most don't take the time to consider when they pass judgment on the actions taken in officers. So anytime we can empower people with more information is going to be beneficial. But the other side of that is that it creates two-way communication. So we can talk until we're blue in the face in classrooms and tell people what they need to know, but it really is that interaction in a non-threatening setting, to where we can have some meaningful discussion and have that two-way dialogue that is going to help all of us calibrate our belief systems.
Thank you, sir.
And I'd like to piggyback on what Patrick and Guillermo said as well, to add that there needs to be a commitment to do this, and not just by word, but by funding. And a commitment, because there are programs that we got involved with where budgetary constraints didn't allow it to continue. And so I think that that's another piece that needs to be part of this.
Can I add just really quickly about the citizens academies, about bringing people in to understand to do what we do? Equally as important as something that happened in NYPD, and those are community academies, where the folks that live and work in those precincts go to the community and learn about the history of that community and who's there, and who are the informal leaders and what is it that they do, and how do you, again to do that two-way. Because too often times we restrict who we mean by community. Like most of us, when we make the call, it is folks that look like my mom, and probably around my age that show up. You're missing a whole group of people who just do not act in this way. They don't communicate in this way. And so I always caution when we say, how do we sustain this from a community perspective, is that you've got new generations of folks where this is not ideal. Having me come to you to learn what you are going to do to me is not what I call learning. And so we're also going to need to rethink about how do we present or offer up what the role is. I think part of the larger conversation about sustainability is, what is the role of policing now? Because if we can answer some of these questions before we get to this, I still think the training is useful. But we're in a shift now. And we're shifting to the point where we're really questioning what's the role of police in public safety. And I think that we have to make sure that whatever we do with this particular, what you want to call anti-bias or whatever, you also have to look at the systems that produce these folks. And so it's one thing to do, a community partner handout, but it's another thing to look inside an organization and see how people get transferred, promoted, get special units. What is the organizational environment inside for them that doesn't feel fair? And so we have to align a lot of things. And I think that it's really important that community does learn that they hold those biases. But I think we also have the opportunity now to unpack all these other things along with it. So we don't just do one thing and try to move on, because we seem to be the only lever people are pulling right now. And I'm going to go back to, I think somebody mentioned it, you've got housing, transportation, health, all with the same issues here. So I just want to make sure that when we talk about pulling one lever, you got to pull them all, because it does seem to sort of stop at the feet of police, and that just can no longer happen.
All right, so in the interest of time, and I'm just going to ask this one question and then we'll wrap up. I'm sorry for the rest of you, we couldn't get to your questions. We had some really good ones, but I think this last one will give people a takeaway from this event, hopefully. So the last question is from Mr. Barry Moore, and he asks, what do you recommend as a way to bring policy in line with training to ensure the change lasts? So what would you recommend as a way to bring policy in alignment with making sure that these types of trainings have lasting effects on departments? I'm adding the last piece, sorry.
One thing that I would add or say to that is, we have to change the questions that we keep asking. We have to make the questions match the outcomes that we want. And I don't think we do that. I think we are stuck in an old way of asking questions, and we'll get, the definition of crazy is doing the same thing over and over again. We have to change that. If we want more diversity in police, we got to ask questions that lead to that. If we want trust in the police, in community with police, when we're recruiting, we got to ask, what's your strength in that area? We have to attach the questions that match what we're looking for to see happen.
If we look across the country, we find a number of agencies that truly get it. They're very proactive. They have great community relationships. They have low crime. They have these partnerships that exist. Now, we talk about policy and how policy meets with the outcome. I would suggest that maybe put in an equal amount of attention to the models of those that truly get it. Those agencies that are diverse, those agencies that truly have that right mixture. That's the ones we ought to be highlighting and pointing out, because I think, I'll just piggyback what was just said by Mr. Lopez. When you always do what you always did, you always get what you always got. And if I think in a lot of instances, we don't know what we're not getting. And I think if we can highlight those that truly have that good mixture with agencies that have that strong community relationship and are not dealing with some of the crises we see all across this country, that's the ones we ought to be learning from, because they get it. They get it, and they practice it every day, and that's when policy meets practice.
Thank you. I just want to thank the panel again and thank everybody for attending. And to everybody that's watching, you will be able to get this on social media afterwards. But here's the takeaway I really want you to get from this. If you look at everybody's bio from this session, you would have thought people would have came on here yelling at each other, screaming at each other, or having vehement disagreements about issues. What this proves is I don't think we're too far apart on these issues and how we approach them. And as a society, I personally am hopeful that we can move forward and that we can continue to do what we need to do to ensure that we all get along. And law enforcement, I still believe, is one of the most noble professions on the face of the earth. And I do think that our communities do need and expect great policing. And we expect police officers to respect everybody, but at the same time, we have to respect the police officers that come into our neighborhoods too.
Thanks for following along with this series about law enforcement anti-bias programs on the Encore series. We thank you for your support, and remember, our upcoming episode releases are every Wednesday, and published exclusively on Tuesdays is our monthly Icons episode. We hope you learned something from this episode and will join us next time for another edition of Encore, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations. A special thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of Encore, a series from the Precinct 444 podcast network by the National Law Enforcement Museum. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.